The components of critical theory, largely power, sovereignty, and development, were the primary lens through which this study was designed and carried out. Social justice issues were also present from international and individual levels. Elite individuals within many countries' social cohorts have used education to maintain their and their group's positions over time. Countries often strive to maintain dominance in their subregion or region. The global community is no different with its power dynamics between the global North and global South, between economically self-determining countries and those countries which are not economically self-determining, between multipolar dominance of a few countries and the rest of the world. The power dynamics result in policies and policy enactment which can be, and in this research will be, assessed and evaluated. Therefore, multi-level social justice is the secondary lens through which this study's examination of public policy, organizational change and development, and authoritarian governance practices and literature will be viewed. Addressing the research question through critical theory and social justice perspectives necessitates an examination of the goals of EIE and EEPs. Education provided in emergencies is meant to be just that, provided in emergencies. In situations where a country is recovering from violent conflict, where a population is displaced because of local or regional conflict, or where conditions are such that they mimic a post-conflict environment, governments and international organizations contract for entities external to the refugee hosting government to provide education services. The EEPs also have a goal and role in helping the existing education system leaders adapt to new requirements for education service provision. The purpose of education assistance in these cases is most often so children do not lose the level of education gained, so a generation of youths are not left for long periods of time without education, so that children and families have some sort of structure around which to build their new lives, and so the hosting education system can take over responsibilities for education service provision. As with any policy analysis, funding and budgets are significant components of the implementation. The current international financial considerations for international organizations are such that budgets for education provision are decreasing while the number and longevity of EIE requirements is increasing. While most organizations are focused on increasing the funding for education programs by advocating for increased donor funding, there seems to be a gap in understanding how EIE programs might be coherently and responsibly decreased and primary responsibility for education placed with the hosting nation. The majority of researchers and practitioners are focused on how to provide more and better education in emergency contexts, i.e., curriculum considerations, teacher training, etc. However, it is problematic that there is very little information available from researchers or practitioners on EEP transitions or exit strategies. The lack of sustainability is based in part on EEP and donor budget fluctuations, projected budget shortfalls, the lack of locally generated education funding budgets from most countries hosting displaced populations, the lack of host country loans and repayments incurred in hosting POCs and POC education, lack of trained teachers, and lack of experienced education leadership for both schools and ministries. While providing education might serve donors' short-term goals of humanitarian service provision, the reality of enabling resource dependencies in these areas encourages labeling the donor activities as disingenuous and possibly cultivating, quote, educational colonialism, unquote. Short-term resource outsourcing, if deliberate and planned, likely is a feasible alternative when and if government oversight is effective. However, long-term resource dependence on EEPs serves no one's best interests. Nonetheless, lack of resources and the lack of planning for transitions to the hosting nation make the current rate of transition from EIE to national government near zero. This is unsustainable if both EEPs and national government's goals are to move toward a sustainable, stable national educational system. The problem, therefore, is that EEPs seem to have no clear strategy for transitioning from emergency education provision to refugee hosting countries, either directly or indirectly providing for POC education in the countries they now live. And although two recent UNHCR documents reference a new policy to have refugee populations absorbed into the hosting national education systems, the scope of this book did not incorporate philosophical and practical issues regarding POC inclusion. The final aspect of the scope and perspectives of this book focused on investigating the actuality of planning for transitions from EEPs to either the direct or indirect responsibility of refugee hosting countries. Themes in the following literature reviews address the nature of the EIE problem as it is understood based on contextualized institutions, policies, and practices from the past. They also address the power dynamic between internal and external governing entities through critical theory and social justice perspectives which are particularly salient to informing research data collection methods for this study. Even with critical theory to provide the framework for a deeper layer of analysis for the political and economic realism that birthed the development industry after World War II, there has been a dichotomy between the political realism of how institutions use aid for political purposes at the national level and the institution's advertised idealism of humanitarian aid and assistance occurring most frequently at the individual level. The theories and levels of analysis are generally misaligned. This mismatched level of analysis, individual versus government with government institutions retaining supremacy, seems to be at odds with the Westphalian concepts of state sovereignty, mutually recognized state sovereignty, and the responsibility of the state to provide for those within its borders. The mismatch has been further exacerbated at the end of the 20th century with the international codification of the responsibility to protect RTP ethos adopted by United Nations members. The RTP adoption at the global organization level on behalf of individuals added a dimension of obligation to state governments for all peoples. While the present research cannot correct the misalignment, the research will proceed with a significant awareness that the misalignment exists and may further entrench the disparity.